The morning I found the footage, I was parked at the Ledford Road pull-off with my laptop balanced on the center console and a StealthCam SD card in the reader. October 2012. Fog in the creek bottoms, the Snowbird Mountains, a dark wall to the north, the kind of cold that works through door seals and floorboard gaps in thin layers and reminds you that a Carolina mountain October is nothing like the picture on the calendar. I'd done this same camera check 100 times in 9 years of working the Cheoah District. I almost scrolled past the clip. 47 seconds of black and white infrared, time-stamped 3:17 in the morning, and in those 47 seconds I watched something I had no name for. Grip a section of woven wire fence with both hands. Bend the wire back at an angle. No black bear, or white-tailed deer, or anything else I'd encountered in 22 years of working these mountains could manage, hold the gap wide open, and stand there, patient and still, while a trapped doe found her footing, fought her leg free from the remaining wire, and ran. It waited until she was clear. Then it turned and looked directly into the camera lens for 3 full seconds. Then it stepped backward into the timber, and the frame went empty. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Mark Patterson. I was a patrol ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, Cheoah Ranger District, Nantahala National Forest, for 19 years. Before I tell you what I found on that mountainside and what came after, you need to understand something about Graham County, North Carolina, because the land shapes this story as it shapes everything that happens in it. Graham County sits in the far southwest corner of North Carolina, pushed up against the Tennessee line and folded into the southern Blue Ridge in a configuration that makes it one of the most remote places east of the Mississippi. About 8,000 people live across 120,000 acres that are almost entirely forested, and most of those acres belong to the Nantahala National Forest. The county seat is Robbinsville, which has a stoplight, a Dollar General, a diner where the coffee runs strong and the biscuits are better than they have any right to be, and in the early evening the mountains close in from 3 sides like a cupped hand around the town. 3/4 of the county is outside cell coverage. The gravel forest roads the district maintains wash out in wet years, and we spend summers arguing with the regional office over equipment to fix them. The argument usually ends with us fixing them ourselves or leaving them and routing around. The Nantahala isn't the kind of national forest that tourists recognize by name as they recognize Yellowstone or the Great Smokies. What it has is over 500,000 acres of southern Appalachian forest, some of the most biologically rich temperate woodland in North America. Yellow poplar, white oak, red oak, chestnut oak, eastern hemlock lining the creek drainages, rhododendron and mountain laurel so thick in places it closes over the trails and shuts out the sky. At the upper elevations, the southern fringe of the spruce fir belt begins, and up there, the world changes entirely. Cold and still and green even in August. Red spruce growing from moss-covered boulders, the air thin enough that you feel the altitude in your lungs on a steep climb. Within the Nantahala, in the heart of Graham County, there's a stretch of country called the Snowbird Mountains. Not as famous as the Great Smokies to the north, or the Unicoi along the Tennessee border, but older feeling, more compressed, the kind of terrain that resists travel. The ridges are steep and the hollows are deep, and the creek drainages cut through the forest in ways that make a topographic map an exercise in optimism. The Joyce Kilmer-Slickrock Wilderness runs along the western edge of this country, 15,000 acres of old-growth and near-old-growth forest, where the yellow poplars are 4 and 5 feet across at the base, and the understory is so layered and dense that full summer light never reaches the forest. Floor at noon. I had walked every trail in that wilderness multiple times over, and there were still creek drainages I'd never entered because the terrain didn't invite entry and I'd never had a reason that outweighed the difficulty. The people of Graham County are mountain people in the truest sense of the phrase. They've been on this ground for generations, in most cases, and they know it the way you know a house you grew up in, by feel and by smell and by the way sound moves through it differently depending on the season. There's a Cherokee element to the cultural texture here too, though the tribal land of the Eastern Band begins just to the north in Swain County. The mountains don't care much for county boundaries, and neither does the knowledge that comes from spending your life in them. When someone from Graham County tells you something about a piece of ground, they're usually right, and they usually didn't learn it from a book. The Snowbird Mountains change through the year in ways that a person who has only visited in summer would not recognize. In October, when the hardwoods on the mid-slopes start turning, and the sourwood and black gum go first, and then the maples follow in a sequence you can track week by week, the whole drainage looks like something burning from the inside. In January, when the hemlock canopy is the only green thing visible, and the birches are white against a gray sky, and the creek runs black between ice-edged banks, the snowbird becomes a different country. I worked in that terrain through every season for 19 years, and the thing I came back to most often was how completely different it felt depending on when you entered it. The same drainage in August and the same drainage in February are not the same place in any sense the body registers. Different smells, different sounds, different weight to the silence in the canopy. That variability matters to this story because the thing I found in those mountains found me across all of those seasons, and what we built between us, whatever you want to call it, was built across every one of them.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
I grew up in Mitchell County, about 60 miles northeast as the crow flies, but 2 hours by road. Mitchell County is Blue Ridge country proper. The spruce fir summits around Roan Mountain, burley tobacco in the lower fields, small towns where the family names on the mailboxes have been on the same ground since before the Civil War. My father was a power company lineman who worked ice storm callouts at 2 in the morning and came home the next afternoon needing sleep more than food. My mother kept books at a hardware store in Spruce Pine. We weren't farmers, but we lived close enough to farming culture that I knew which neighbors had beef cattle and which had dairy and which were running sheep up on the summer pasture above the ridge. I hunted grouse and squirrel from the time I was old enough to hold a gun safely, and shot my first deer at 15 with a .30-06 that had belonged to my grandfather, a bolt-action Remington that kicked hard enough to raise a bruise on my shoulder that I wore proudly for 2 weeks. I started at Appalachian State and stayed a year. The campus at Boone is in the mountains and the surroundings were fine, but the institution didn't suit me, and I transferred to Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, which is in Jackson County, right next door to Graham. The Natural Resources program at Western Carolina put me in the field from the first semester, and it was in the field that I found what I'd been looking for without knowing it. My first real time in the Nantahala was a class field exercise in the Joyce Kilmer Forest. The professor sent us in with data sheets and a sampling protocol, and most of the students turned back at the Third Creek crossing because the water was cold and the trail was harder than it looked on the map. I kept going. I was in that old-growth stand for 4 hours alone, measuring yellow poplars that were old when the colony of North Carolina was young, and when I walked back to the trailhead in the late afternoon, I'd made up my mind. I submitted my first application for a USFS posting in the Nantahala before I had my diploma. It took 13 years. The USFS doesn't move fast, and neither does the competitive process for ranger positions in desirable districts. I worked the Pisgah Ranger District in Transylvania County for 6 years. Long enough to know the land well, but not long enough that it felt like mine. A stretch in the Uwharrie, which is Piedmont country, and which I respected but never loved. 2 years at the Appalachian Ranger District in Watauga County. By the time the Cheoah posting opened in the fall of 2002, I was 37 years old, and the patience had been about used up. I put my application in the day the posting was announced, and I drove to Robbinsville for the interview wearing the only dress shirt I owned. The Cheoah Ranger District covers roughly 200,000 acres of the Nantahala, most of Graham County, and a slice of Cherokee County to the south. A patrol ranger in a district that size is handling a dozen things at once on any given shift. Law enforcement on the recreation areas, resource monitoring in the backcountry, trail maintenance coordination, fire lookout communication, responding to incidents that range from lost hikers to timber theft, to confrontations with hunters who view federal regulations as personal suggestions directed at them specifically. I wore a Forest Service uniform and a badge and drove a white government truck and had learned over 13 years that in the rural counties of Western Carolina, a USFS ranger occupied a particular social position, something between the county extension agent and the sheriff's department, recognized and generally respected even when not liked, understood as part of the institutional furniture of the place. Gail Rutherford had been the district wildlife biologist for 15 years when I transferred in. She was a precise woman, methodical, with a memory for individual animals in the bear and deer populations that was essentially photographic, and a vocabulary that switched between scientific terminology and blunt western North Carolina plainness depending on who she was talking to. She'd grown up in Macon County, one drainage east, and she had the kind of local credibility that a career's worth of being right earns you in a rural community. I trusted her judgment the way you trust the judgment of someone who has been doing a hard job well for longer than you have been doing it at all. The cameras I set along the Ledford fence line that September were part of a bear corridor study Gail had been developing. She had documented a seasonal travel corridor connecting two areas of high-elevation mast habitat on opposite ends of the Snowbird ridgeline. Bears were moving between the two areas along a route that used the creek drainages and the contour bands below the ridge crests, and she needed camera data at several points along the route to document the frequency and timing of movement. She'd placed cameras herself at 6 locations. She asked me to set 4 more along a section that crossed what she called the Ledford Zone, partly because I knew that stretch of ground from my patrol routes, and partly because the landowner coordination was something she preferred not to handle directly. Coy Ledford and I had an understanding built over 9 years of being neighboring interests. He called me when he had problems with trespassers or game violations, and I called him when I needed access or when something was happening on the district boundary that he'd want to know about. We got along the way you get along in a county where bad blood with the federal land manager is just one more complication you don't need. The Ledford family had farmed the same ground in Graham County for 4 generations. Coy's great-grandfather had cleared the original pasture out of the snowbird timber sometime in the early years of the 20th century, working by hand and by draft animal as mountain farming was done before mechanization got into the hollows. The family had been running Angus cross cattle on the operation since Coy's grandfather's time, around 380 acres of combination pasture and woodlot. The pasture along the lower contours of Ledford Creek and the woodlot climbing the slope toward the national forest boundary. It was not a prosperous operation by modern cattle farming standards. It was the kind of operation that survived because the land was paid for and the people running it knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need much margin to stay in the game. The boundary fence was a piece of history worth understanding. The eastern portion of what was now Ledford family land had been sold to the Forest Service in 1961, about 110 acres of ridgeline timber that Coy's grandfather sold because the timber had been cut twice, and the offer from the government was fair by the standards of the time. The fence that had run along the property line before the sale was still there 40 years later, strung with old woven wire on wooden posts at 8-foot spacings, the kind of agricultural fencing that was standard in western North Carolina in the 40s and 50s. The posts were rotting at the base from a half-century of contact with mountain soil, and the wire had sagged and settled in places where posts had shifted, bringing the effective height down from 5 feet to 4, or even less in the lowest sections. It was not an impressive fence. It was still standing in most places, which in that terrain and that climate was more of an accomplishment than it sounds. Woven wire fence and white-tailed deer are a bad combination in mountain country. A doe can clear a 5-foot fence cleanly if she times her jump right, but the old Ledford boundary fence had enough low sections that deer push through rather than jumping, and when a deer pushes through woven wire and a leg slips into one of the mesh gaps, panic does the rest of the damage. The animal drives the trapped leg deeper into the wire, trying to pull free, and within a minute or two, the situation goes from uncomfortable to critical. I had cut 2 deer out of that fence in my 9 years on the district. A young buck in late September of 2008 with his right foreleg through the second highest course of wire, and a doe in May of 2011 with both front legs through a single gap in a low section that the post had leaned into. Coy had called me both times. Both animals survived the cutting out, though the buck had a laceration on the foreleg that I had him watch for infection. I placed 4 stealth cam no-glow units along a 300-yard section of that fence in the first week of September 2012. Stealth Cam made a camera that used 940-nanometer infrared LEDs for night triggering, which put the illumination in a wavelength range invisible to both deer and humans, unlike the older cameras with red glow LEDs that sometimes spooked sensitive animals. The cameras triggered on motion within about 40 feet and shot 30-second video clips to an SD card. I strapped each one to a tree on the National Forest side of the fence, angled to cover the fence line and about 20 feet of the pasture on the far side. I mapped the positions in my field notebook and checked each unit twice in the first week to confirm the angle and the trigger range. Over the first 6 weeks, the cameras gave Gail exactly what the bear study needed: 5 separate bears documented on the corridor, including a 300-pound boar that Gale had tagged in 2009 and hadn't relocated since. Deer in numbers that were better than I'd expected for that section of fence. Wild turkey in 2 separate flocks, one with 7 hens and one with an old tom that had spurs long enough to make an impression even in infrared. A coyote that worked the fence line over several nights running, nose down, following whatever scent trail the deer left at the crossing points. 2 gray foxes that showed up on the same camera on the same night 2 weeks apart, which I noted as unusual. All of it routine wildlife documentation in healthy southern Appalachian forest. And then, on the night of October 21st, the 47 seconds of footage that I almost scrolled past. That date is as fixed in my memory as anything I've carried in 59 years. October 21st, 2012, 3:17 in the morning. Those details don't leave you once you've attached them to something that changes your understanding of what shares the watershed with you. I want to describe it carefully. I've gone over it hundreds of times in 12 years, on screen and in memory, and I want to get it right because the details matter and because some of the details are the kind that a wildlife professional would notice and a general audience might not. The footage from camera 2 begins with a clip at 3:14 in the morning. In that first clip, a doe stands at the fence line, visible in the right quarter of the frame. She has already been there long enough for the camera to have captured her approach in a prior clip, because the clip begins mid-sequence, and she is not walking in from outside the frame. She is already at the fence. Her right hind leg is through the wire at the second lowest course, pushed through to mid-thigh, and she is standing with her weight shifted forward and her back end twisted at an angle that communicates entrapment before you consciously register the wire. She has been caught. She has stopped struggling, the stillness of an animal that has exhausted every option, and she is standing with her head up and her ears turned north, listening. The second clip begins at 3:17 and 13 seconds. Something enters the frame from the left, not from the timber, from along the fence line, moving parallel to the wire on the forest side, coming from the north, at a pace that I can only describe as purposeful, not rushing, walking with the ease of something that knows exactly where it is going. It is large. The fence posts in the frame are standard agricultural steel posts, their tops visible at just over 5 feet above the ground where they project above the wire. The thing moving along the fence line passes those posts with its head noticeably clearing the wire. It stands well above the top of the fence. The body is broad through the chest and shoulders, the proportions of a heavily built person but scaled up, everything wider and deeper than human scale. The hair covers the entire visible body from crown to ankle, a deep brown that reads as near black in infrared, thicker and denser along the back and upper shoulders, thinning on the forearms and shins, where it is fine enough that the skin shows as a lighter band in the IR exposure. The arms hang long at the sides, the hands large, the fingers thick and slightly curved in the relaxed position. The face. I need to talk about the face because the face is where the forensic details are. The brow ridge is heavy, putting the eyes deep in shadow, even in the flat exposure of infrared. The nose is broad, the nostrils wide and flared. The jaw is substantial, and the mouth is a straight, closed line. And the eyes. The detail that stopped me when I watched this footage for the first time and that I still find myself returning to. The eyes do not reflect. Every wildlife professional who works with trail camera footage knows what animal eyes look like in infrared. The tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that most mammals have and that gives them better night vision than we have. That layer sends the IR light straight back at the camera lens and produces the white mirror flash that makes deer eyes look like 2 small LEDs and bear eyes glow like coals. Every deer on every other clip from those cameras showed that reflection. The thing in this clip did not. The eyes appeared as deep, dark circles under the brow ridge, absorptive rather than reflective, exactly as a human eye responds to IR illumination. Humans do not have a tapetum lucidum. Whatever this was, in this particular detail, its visual anatomy was more like ours than like a deer's. It walked to where the doe was trapped and stopped about 6 feet from the fence. The doe exploded the instant it came near, all 4 legs thrashing, twisting against the wire, driving herself harder into the mesh. The thing stopped. It waited. It stood with its hands at its sides, the head tilted slightly toward the struggling deer. Nothing threatening in the posture. Nothing aggressive. Just waiting. And the deer ran out of fight. as deer do when everything they've tried has failed and their system finally accepts that struggle is only making it worse. When the doe went still, the thing moved to the fence. It crouched, the way a large person crouches to look at something at ground level, and it took hold of the wire on either side of where the doe's leg was caught. Both hands on the wire, one grip above the trap section and one below, and then it pulled, slowly, controlled. Agricultural woven wire is built to hold cattle and it resists at full tension, but the wire in that section gave. The gap opened. The doe's leg dropped free. She scrambled, got her footing, and lunged away to the right, off into the pasture. The thing held the wire open until she was gone. Then it released the wire and rose to its full height. And then it turned toward the camera. I have watched those 3 seconds more times than I can count. The face coming around to face the lens directly. The eyes finding the camera without searching for it, without scanning, going straight to it as you look at something you've already been watching. 3 seconds of looking, full face to lens, and then 1 step backward, 2, and the timber absorbed it the way a creek absorbs rain, completely, without trace, and the fence and the empty pasture were all that was left. I sat in the truck for a long time. Cold was working in through the door seals, and I didn't notice it. Then I played the clip again. Then I got out of the truck and stood in the October air and looked at the tree line across the pull-off, and then I got back in and played the clip a third time, frame by frame, at the slowest speed the software could manage. The doe had been trapped from some point before the 3:14 clip. How long before was unclear. The thing had come from the north, from the national forest, along the fence line, and freed her. Then looked at the camera for 3 seconds. 3 seconds is a short time. It is also long enough to know you are being observed and to choose, with full awareness, to look at the thing that is observing you. That distinction mattered. It was the first piece of information I had about the intelligence of what I was dealing with, and it shaped every decision I made for the next 8 years. I did not call Gail Rutherford. I did not file a report. I drove back to Robbinsville, sat at my desk in the district office, and I thought for a long time about what I'd seen and what I was going to do about it. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made the only decision that felt right. I was going to go back to that fence line and learn more before I did anything else. A wildlife officer makes calls like that by instinct more than calculation. I had watched enough of the institutional machinery of a federal agency respond to significant findings to know what happened next if I walked that footage into the regional office. I'd worked a spotted owl survey in the Pisgah in '98 that tied up 3 ranger districts for 2 full summers and produced a management document that sat in a filing cabinet in Asheville. I'd watched a species discovery finding generate a cascade of attention that drove the thing discovered into territories so remote it effectively ceased to be observable. The machinery of institutional response is built for documentation and process does not move quietly. Whatever was on that camera had watched me set those cameras in September. I was as certain of that as I was certain of anything in 22 years of fieldwork. Something smart enough to watch, patient enough to wait weeks, and considered enough to help a deer out of a fence in the dark, and then look at a camera it already knew was there, was not going to stand around while a survey team flew helicopters over the Snowbird drainage. Reporting it meant losing it. Protecting it meant silence. The following Monday, I pulled the SD cards from all 4 cameras and replaced them. The other 3 cameras had nothing unusual. Camera 2 had 3 more clips after the 3:17 sequence, 2 deer at different times, 1 coyote well after dawn. Nothing unexpected. I reformatted the original cards, copied the 47-second clip to a hard drive I kept at my house, and put the cards back in service, as if nothing had changed. Over the next several weeks, I started walking the fence line on my own time. Before shift, after shift, on my days off. Not every day. Enough to learn the patterns. I was looking for sign the way I'd look in any survey context. Tracks in soft creek bank material, hair caught on wire or bark, disturbed vegetation, compressed areas in leaf litter that indicated regular resting or standing positions. The first thing I found wasn't physical sign, it was absence. There's a strip of timber between the fence line and a creek drainage about 400 yards to the east, a run of dense eastern hemlock and rhododendron with a canopy that shuts out most of the light even in October. That timber strip had been a reliable deer bedding area in every year I'd been on the district. Coy Ledford called it the pantry because the deer in it were, in his words, stacked up like cordwood. Camera 2 had documented 17 separate deer individuals using that strip as an approach corridor over the summer. After the footage, the deer stopped using it. Not overnight, but the pattern tapered clearly over the course of November. One by one, the bedding deer shifted their routes west and south. By the last week of November, the cameras showed deer still moving through the strip occasionally, but nothing stopping. Nothing bedding. Everything crossing and continuing as deer move through territory that belongs to something else. The first track I found was in the first week of November, in a stretch of soft creek bank under a hemlock where a wet season seep kept the clay perpetually damp. A single footprint, left foot, the heel clear, and pressing nearly 3 inches into the clay. The toes were scuffed from a weight shift and not fully defined, but the heel pad was intact, 4.5 inches wide. I measured the visible length from heel to the leading edge of the scuff and got 18 inches. I paced the distance from that mark to where the right foot had come down in softer ground 20 feet ahead, 62 inches. I put my own boot next to the heel impression. My boot is a size 12. The heel pad of my boot is about 3.25 inches wide, and my stride walking at an easy pace is about 32 inches. I photographed it with my personal camera, a Nikon point-and-shoot I kept in my jacket for field notes. No identifying information in the frame. My boot for scale, nothing else. I transferred the photographs to a personal memory card I kept at home and not on any district computer. Coy Ledford called me in mid-November. He wanted to talk about the East Pasture. I drove out to the farm on a Thursday, drank his bad coffee at the kitchen table, and listened to what had been happening with his cattle. The herd, about 60 Angus cross cattle, had been refusing the East Pasture at night, not the pasture itself. They'd graze it through the day, pushing toward the fence line as cattle do when the grass is good near the boundary. But before dark, they were coming in on their own, all the way to the barn lot, without being called. Coy had been running cattle for 30 years, and his father before him, and he said he'd never seen 60 head make that decision voluntarily without persuasion. He wasn't alarmed. That was what I noticed. He'd already processed it, as a farmer processes anomalies, as data without immediate drama, and he was bringing it to me because I was the right person to bring it to, not because he was frightened. He said the cattle weren't distressed during the day. They weren't watching the fence line with their ears pinned. They just didn't want to be in that field after dark, and they'd worked out a system for making that clear. He had 2 blue heelers for working cattle, both good dogs, both experienced with the routine of moving animals across the farm. He said both dogs had stopped going past the machine shed after dark. They'd sit at the edge of the shed and look east and whine. Not bark, not bristle, whine. Like they'd made a decision about the East Pasture and were waiting for the rest of the household to catch up. I asked about sounds. He said nothing unusual. I asked about smell. He thought about it and said that sometimes, on still nights when the air was settling into the hollow, there was something he couldn't quite name that came off the east fence, heavy and warm, not unpleasant exactly, more like what comes off a livestock operation that isn't his. He'd thought it was a neighbor's farm somewhere up the ridge. There was no farm up the ridge. I told him I'd look into it. I did not tell him what I already knew. 2 weeks after that conversation, he called again. He'd been riding the fence line on his four-wheeler to check for downed trees after a wind event, and he'd found a 40-foot section of the east fence pushed flat, not blown over, not pulled down, pushed, from the forest side toward the pasture, the entire width of the fence laid over and pressed against the ground on the pasture side. The fence posts were still in the ground, still upright, the wire still attached to them, but the posts were bent at the base, at the ground line, and the 8 feet of fencing that had been vertical was now horizontal. He'd retensioned the wire as best he could with a come-along, but the posts that had bent at the base had lost their rigidity, and the fence in that section was, in his phrase, more of a suggestion than a fence. I drove out the next day and looked at it. Bent steel T-posts. Agricultural fence posts are high-strength steel, driven into the ground and left to rust and set for years. And bending them at the base without pulling them out or breaking them requires sustained horizontal force applied at the top. The force required to bend that gauge of steel at ground level, with the earth acting as the fulcrum and the force applied at the top of a 6-foot post, is not something I can calculate precisely, but I know what generates it and what doesn't. It is not a bear. Bears lean on fences, push with their chest, can push wooden posts loose from their setting, But this kind of bend on a steel post at grade requires a sustained lateral force that a bear's weight and mechanics don't produce. It is not a human. There is no tool or machine that does this by accident. Something had walked through that fence the way you walk through a screen door you forgot was closed. I went back to the fence line that week and walked the full east section. On the forest side of the pushed area, in the duff under the hemlock where the leaf layer was thin over a clay seam, I found 2 complete prints. Left and right, walking straight through, in the direction of the pasture, with no hesitation or sidestep that would indicate the fence had registered as an obstacle. The stride was 63 inches. The depth in the clay, hard clay, cold clay, it was November, was over 2 inches at the heel. I stood there in the hemlock timber in the November cold looking at those prints, and I understood for the first time the full scale of what I was dealing with. The camera footage had told me something was large and capable of purposeful behavior. The fence had told me something about its physical capacity. But standing at those prints, understanding the direction of travel, the straight line from the hemlock strip through the bent fence toward the pasture, what I felt was not fear. It was the specific sensation I'd felt a handful of times in 22 years of wildlife work, when a piece of evidence makes a category of thing suddenly real that had previously been theoretical. The sensation of the catalog expanding. I checked all 4 cameras the following Saturday. Cameras 1, 3, and 4 were normal. Camera 2 was there. The strap was intact. The battery was running. But the camera was facing northeast instead of northwest. It had been rotated on its mounting about 90 degrees. The fence line I'd been monitoring was no longer in the frame. The camera was looking at a section of forest floor behind the fence, 10 yards back, recording the base of a hemlock tree. The camera had been turned on purpose. I had not touched it on my last visit. I had confirmed the green status light from 6 feet and left. Wind doesn't rotate a camera on a strap. An animal nudging a camera pulls it down or leaves scratch marks on the housing. This was a controlled rotation. Strap loosened, camera turned, strap retightened. Done carefully enough not to produce a triggering event that would be recorded. Or there had been a triggering event. I pulled the card with the portable reader I kept in my jacket and checked on the spot. The footage from the previous 3 weeks was clean through November 10th. Then an 8-hour gap, 10 at night through 6 in the morning, with no clips. The camera had been running. The battery showed no interruption. The sensor hadn't triggered. Then, from the 11th onward, clean footage again, the camera now facing northeast, recording the wrong thing. Whatever had come to that camera in the night had put the camera into a state where it was powered but not capturing, then turned it. I don't know the mechanism. I know the result. And I know that a 940 nanometer no-glow infrared camera still emits infrared light when it's operating, just in a wavelength outside the human visible spectrum. Many mammals can see near infrared. If whatever was in that hemlock strip had better than human IR sensitivity, it had seen the camera glowing every time it triggered, every night I had it running, from the day I set it in September. It had known the camera was there the whole time. It had been watching it, and it had decided that the particular angle I'd chosen, aimed at the fence line, was not something it was willing to continue to allow. I reoriented camera 2 back to the fence line and tightened the strap, and I stood in the hemlock timber, and I was not alone. Not the kind that makes you reach for a weapon. The kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Air that carries another intelligence somewhere in it, present and aware, with its own read on what you are and what you're doing there. I stood still, said nothing, looked at the ground in front of my boots, not scanning the timber, not searching. That posture when you want to communicate that you are not a threat and are not hunting. It is something you learn to do around wild animals if you spend enough time with them, and I had spent a long time with them. After a while, I heard it. Not close. 80 yards into the hemlock, maybe more, somewhere in the direction of the densest canopy, where the branches overhead were so interlocked they held out most of the November sky. A tone. Low. Not a grunt, not a rumble. A sustained note with a slow variation in pitch, a slight wavering from one register to another, going on for 5 or 6 seconds and then stopping. Then again, shorter, 3 seconds or so, then nothing. I didn't move. When the second tone faded, I said, quietly, to the ground in front of me, not to the trees, "I'll be back. I want you to know that. I'll be back, and I won't come for anything except to be here." The hemlock was quiet. I walked back to the pull-off. The decision not to report is the one I've turned over the most in the years since. I've rehearsed it from every angle I could think of, including the angles that reflect badly on me. The honest accounting is this. I was a federal law enforcement officer, and I had evidence of a species unknown to science operating in my district, and I chose not to report it. That is a professional breach by any strict reading of my duties. I have never reconciled that breach. I have decided that some things weigh more than the breach, and that the weight is proportional to what gets protected. The bear study closed in January of 2013. I submitted Gale's data. The report was accurate for every bear it documented. The 47-second clip was not included, and the SD cards from camera 2 were reformatted, and whatever was in the Cheoah District's files from that period contains no record of what I found on October 22, 2012. I started going back to the Hemlock Strip on my own time that winter. Not on a schedule, when I could, before shift, after shift, on days off. I parked at the pull-off and walked the fence line to the Hemlock section and sat on a fallen tulip poplar log near the creek and waited. The log had been down long enough that the bark was mostly gone, and the wood was silver gray and sound enough to hold weight. One day out of 3, sometimes better, the tone would come. Always from the north. Always that low, sustained quality, the wavering pitch that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Sometimes it lasted 30 seconds. Once, in January, it went for nearly 2 minutes without stopping, rising and falling in a slow pattern that I eventually started to hear as something more structured than random, though I couldn't have told you then what the structure was. I started talking on those visits, not directly to it, not addressing the timber, to myself, mostly, as you do on long solo time in the field when there's nobody to talk to and silence gets to feeling like pressure. I'd talk about the day's work, about the trail maintenance project that had been on the district's deferred list for 4 years, about the repair on my truck that I kept putting off, about a call I'd had with my sister in Spruce Pine. Ordinary things, the talk of a person alone in the woods with their own mind. The tone responded to talk. I noticed it within the first week. When I sat quiet, the tone would come and go at its own rhythm. When I talked, the tone changed. It would slow its cycle, lower its register slightly, hold longer between the wavering rises and falls. The kind of adjustment a person makes with their breathing when they shift from their own thoughts to listening to someone else's. This was not my imagination. I observed it too many times across too many visits for it to be chance. It was listening when I talked, and the listening was audible. In February, with the creek running low under a skin of ice and the hemlock branches loaded with an overnight snowfall that hadn't fallen yet, the tone came from a different direction. Not north, east, closer. I estimated maybe 40 yards. And when I left that day and walked back along the creek bank, I found prints in the snow, fresh, still crisp at the edges, no melting of the outline yet. They went from the east, toward the log where I'd been sitting, to within about 30 yards of it, and then turned back north. Approach and retreat. A line drawn at 30 yards that had not been a line at 40 or 50. It had come closer, and then turned around. That movement, approach to a point, and then back, felt less like hesitation and more like decision. Not afraid of me. Not uncertain. Drawing a boundary it had decided on. At a distance it had judged, for reasons that were its own and that I was not going to rush. I sat with that for the rest of the winter. In March, the snow was gone from the creek bank and the hepatica was coming up in the spots where the hemlock canopy opened and the spring light reached the ground, those small pale flowers that bloom before the leaves on the deciduous trees, and that always seemed slightly wrong for the season, too early, too delicate. The creek was running full with snowmelt and the hemlocks were dripping, and the air had that first of spring quality, cold and clean and with a green smell rising from the wet leaf litter. I was on the log on a Wednesday morning, early, before my shift. I'd been there about 40 minutes. The tone had come twice. From the north, the second time lasting nearly a minute. The hemlock strip was the way it always was, dark even in March morning light, the branches dense enough to hold most of the sky out. I felt it before I heard anything. A change in the air temperature, the kind of drop that comes when a large body moves through still air and pushes a current ahead of it, and then a sound from my right, from the north. A footfall, a single compression in the mud of the creek bank, the wet sound of significant weight on saturated soil. At a distance I put at about 50 feet. I did not turn my head. I kept looking at the far bank of the creek, at the hepatica growing in a frost hollow under the hemlocks on the far side. I breathed slow, and I did not move. Another step. Closer. Maybe 40 feet. Another. 30. The sound was different from any footfall I'd heard in 22 years of working these mountains. It hit the ground with a weight that came from mass, not from haste. The kind of step that knows the ground will hold it. 25 feet, maybe less. Then it stopped. I waited. Maybe a count of 30. Then I turned my head slowly to the right and looked north along the creek. It was standing at the edge of the hemlock timber, where the trees gave way to the open creek bank and the morning light fell without obstruction for the first time. About 20 feet from where I sat, in clear view, nothing between us, standing with a stillness that was as complete as a tree's stillness, the body relaxed, the arms at the sides, the head turned very slightly, as if the better ear was forward. The hair was deep brown, the color of the bank clay in the hemlock section after a rain, not quite black in the open morning light. Along the upper back and shoulders it was densest, almost matted from months of moving through hemlock branches and rhododendron thickets. On the forearms it thinned considerably, and I could see skin in the thinner areas, a dark leather brown with a faint gray at the edge. The face was broad, a brow ridge that put the eyes in shadow even in open light. Wide nose, flat, the nostrils large. The jaw was heavy, and the mouth was a closed line, and the expression across the whole face was not a thing I had a single word for. Quiet was the closest I came. Not blank, not aggressive. Quiet in the way that a mountain that has been standing through everything for 10,000 years is quiet. The eyes were amber. Not brown, as most eyes I'd cataloged in 22 years of fieldwork were brown. A warm amber with depth, the way creek water over iron-stained sandstone looks when sunlight hits it at an angle, and they were fixed on me with a quality of attention I had not previously experienced and could not precisely name. The closest I could get was the look of a being that had already figured out what you were and was now seeing whether you knew it yet. We held the distance. 20 feet of wet creek bank and 3 months of patient, asymmetric getting to know each other. It raised its right hand. Slowly, from the side, the palm turned outward. Held it for a count of 4 or 5, open, still, then lowered it. Then it turned and walked into the hemlock and was gone. Not quickly, not fleeing, walking in its easy, ground-covering gait, and the hemlock took it in, as hemlock timber takes everything in, completely, without remainder, and the only proof it had been there was the sound of my own blood moving in my ears and a set of fresh prints in the bank clay that I would photograph and measure and add to the documentation that was building in a hard drive at my house. I drove to the district office, and I did the ordinary work of an ordinary day. I filed a trail closure update for a winter blowdown on the Snowbird Creek Trail. I responded to an inquiry about dispersed camping access. I ate lunch at my desk, and I thought about amber eyes in a hemlock grove and a right-hand raised palm out at 20 feet, and the particular kind of patience that is required to move a distance from 80 yards to 20 feet over 7 months without a single move that felt urgent or threatening. That level of patience is not a thing most living creatures I'd studied possessed. It implied a relationship with time that was different from mine, not indifferent to time, but unconstrained by it, as you're unconstrained by a limitation you've never encountered. I thought about what that might mean for a being living in a mountain range the size of the Snowbirds, with the Joyce Kilmer old growth to the west and the Slickrock Wilderness beyond that, and the high bald country above Hooper Bald above that, all of it connected, all of it accessible to something that could walk through a fence without registering it as an obstacle. I thought about how long it might have been there. Not in the hemlock strip, in these mountains. The encounters continued through 2013 and into the summer of 2014. I went to the hemlock strip on my own time, and the tone came, and the pattern held, and the boundary moved. By the spring of 2013, the approach was consistent at about 15 feet. By June, it had come within 10 yards, once, briefly. On a morning when I'd set a piece of apple on the log before leaving, and come back an hour later. The apple was gone. A fresh print in the bank mud, 16 inches, the stride from that print to the next running north at 58 inches. It had come to the log while I was away, taken the apple, and gone back north. I started thinking of these visits the way I thought of certain kinds of fieldwork, not as surveillance and not as research, but as a kind of mutual attendance. I was there. It was there. The terms of the arrangement were understood by both parties without being negotiated. I showed up regularly. I didn't bring anyone else. I talked quietly to myself, and sometimes to the creek, and sometimes to nothing in particular, and it showed up at its own schedule and held its own distance, and the tone came and went, and the amber eyes appeared in the hemlock edge when it chose to show them. I learned the range it used by following the sign. From the hemlock strip, tracking the prints and the compression marks in the duff over months, I pieced together a territory that extended north and west into the Snowbird ridgeline, following the creek drainages up into the elevations where the canopy shifted from hemlock and hardwood to spruce and fir. The sign thinned considerably more than 3 or 4 miles from the Ledford fence, which told me the hemlock strip was a regular point in a larger circuit, not a permanent residence. A stopping place on a route that probably covered a substantial portion of the central Snowbird drainage, which made ecological sense for a large, mobile hominid with a low population density, which made sense for something that had been in these mountains long enough to know every drainage and every ridge and every seasonal shift in the available food base. In the spring of 2014, Gail Rutherford started talking about retiring. She was in her mid-60s and her knees were as bad as mine were becoming, and she'd been doing hard field work in rough terrain for 30 years, and she'd done what she came to do. I was glad for her, and I would miss her judgment. I was also aware, in a way I kept to myself, that her departure was going to leave the district's wildlife monitoring work in a state of reduced capacity that would mean less oversight of the east fence area from the biology side. One less set of eyes that might find the right thing at the wrong time. That fall, Coy Ledford's son came back. Ricky Ledford was 24, recently graduated from Appalachian State with a degree in agricultural business, back to help his father with the operation. Coy was in his early 60s by then, and the physical work of 380 mountain acres was getting ahead of him as it gets ahead of every farmer eventually. Ricky was a good person. I'd known him since he was 12. He hunted deer and turkey on the family land with a seriousness that I respected, and he had his father's practical disposition, the kind of common sense that comes from growing up on ground that doesn't accommodate wishful thinking. He was not a person who would panic or make impulsive decisions. He set up his own trail camera. Of course he did. He was 24. He hunted. Trail cameras were common equipment for any serious deer hunter in western North Carolina by 2014, and the east pasture bordering the hemlock strip was clearly prime deer habitat. He put a wild game innovations unit on a fence post about 100 yards from the east fence on the pasture side, aimed at a deer crossing where the animals habitually moved between the open pasture and the timber edge at dawn and dusk. Standard hunting camera setup. Exactly what I would have done at 24. He called me in late October. He didn't tell me what was on the camera. He asked me to come out and look at something. His voice had the quality I'd learned to recognize over 19 years of fieldwork, the quality of a person who has found something they can't account for and are choosing not to name it until they see how the other person responds. I drove out to the Ledford farm on a Thursday afternoon. Coy was in the kitchen. Ricky had his laptop open on the table and he turned it to face me and said, "Tell me what that is." Nighttime footage from the wild game camera. Consumer grade, grainy at the edges, as mid-priced IR cameras are grainy, the resolution adequate for deer identification and not much else. A doe had triggered the camera at 11:47 in the evening and was visible at the left edge of the frame. At 11:49, something entered from the right. 8 seconds. Moving across the right side of the frame on 2 legs for the full 8 seconds before going out of frame to the south, upright throughout. The quality wasn't as clean as my stealth cam footage, and the distance was greater, maybe 80 yards, and the angle was oblique, but the proportions were visible. The gait was visible. The height relative to the fence posts in the background was visible. There was no ambiguity about what this was, to someone who had been watching the same animal for 2 years. Ricky looked at me when I looked up from the screen. "Bear?" he said. "Is that your first read?" Walked on 2 legs the whole 8 seconds. Bears don't sustain that without a reason. And the size. That's not a bear. Coy hadn't said anything. He was looking out the kitchen window at the east pasture, which was dark at 4:30 in the afternoon in late October. He had the look of someone who has already worked something out and is waiting to see if the conversation is going to confirm it. I took a breath. I'd been preparing for this scenario in some part of my thinking for 2 years, running through versions of it, deciding in advance what I would say and how. The plan I'd built was a plan for misdirection, for offering an alternative explanation plausible enough to diffuse the immediate question and move Ricky away from further investigation. But sitting at that kitchen table, looking at Ricky Ledford, who was smart and practical and 24 years old, with a camera he could reposition and upgrade, and who had already decided what was in his east pasture, I could see the misdirection plan was not going to hold. He'd look for more footage, better footage. And eventually, he'd find something that moved his conviction from general to specific, and then I would have a problem that was much harder to manage. I told him I wanted to show him something. We drove to the Ledford Road pull-off in my truck. I opened my laptop and I played him the stealth cam footage from October 22nd, 2012. All 47 seconds. The fence. The doe. The hands on the wire, bending it. The waiting. The doe running free. The 3 seconds looking at the camera. Ricky watched without saying anything. Then he watched it again. "How long have you had this?" he said. 2 years. He looked at me steadily. "You didn't report it." "No." "Why not?" I told him what I'd told myself. All of it. The machinery of institutional response. The way officially documented things attract officially institutional attention, and how that attention is not neutral in its effects on whatever it's turned toward. The intelligence I'd observed over 2 years of visiting the Hemlock Strip, the camera it had turned, the boundary it had moved by decision over months, the fact that it had helped a deer out of a fence in the dark and then looked at a camera it already knew was there. I told him that what was living in the Hemlock Strip and the Snowbird drainage above it was living there on its terms, harming nothing, taking nothing from anyone, and that the most important thing anyone could do was allow it to continue doing that. Ricky was quiet for a while after I stopped talking. Outside the truck, the dark was coming in fast as it does in October when the sun hits the ridge and drops, and the Snowbird Mountains to the north were turning from their late afternoon color into the dark mass they became at dusk. "It bent the fence posts," he said. "Yes, and the cattle not going to the east field at night. That's my read. It freed that deer," he said. He was putting the pieces together in the order that made sense to him, which was the order of things that had happened on ground he knew. The fence, the cattle, the deer. He was a farmer's son, accounting for events on a farm. And in that accounting, the deer mattered as the fence, and the cattle mattered as a data point with weight. "What do you want from me?" he said. "Delete the footage off the camera card, and off the laptop, and off any backup you've put it on, and go on running your operation. And if anything damages your property or bothers your stock, you call me first, and I'll make it right whatever I can make right. And if I can't make it right, you can do whatever you decide to do." He thought about that. Then, "And if I say no?" "Then we talk about it together with your dad, and we all decide." He looked out the windshield for a while. The dark was nearly complete. Then he said, "What is it, Tom? Do you actually know?" I said the truest thing I had. "I know what it isn't. Everything else I'm still working on." Ricky deleted the footage that evening. I wasn't there when he did it, but I believe he did, because Ricky Ledford is exactly the kind of person who, when he makes a decision, executes it cleanly. Coy had already made his own peace with the situation by the time Ricky and I talked, I think. Coy had known something was using the east fence area for years, since before the cattle started their nightly retreat, and he'd processed it as old mountain farmers process what they can't explain, quietly, without drama, by adjusting their own behavior to accommodate a reality they've decided isn't their business to contest. Old families in Graham County have their own relationship with what lives in the Snowbird timber. Not all of it is in any written record. The Ledfords replaced the damaged section of the east fence the following spring. They ran a new field fence inside the original line by about 15 feet, on a contour that left the bent posts standing in place and gave the forest side a slightly wider margin. Neither Coy nor Ricky asked me whether 15 feet was enough. I think Coy already knew it would be, the same way he knew which parts of the farm the weather came from and which draws the deer used in the evening. It was a considered adjustment, made by a man who understood what he was adjusting around. Through 2015 and into 2016, I kept going back. The pattern held, the tone came. The boundary held at about 15 feet, which was where it had been since the previous spring, and I had the sense that this was its considered distance, the distance that balanced presence against whatever its own sense of appropriate space was. I wasn't going to push past it. That was not my call to make. In the spring of 2016, I found 2 sets of tracks instead of 1. I was checking the creek bank after a wet week in April, the bank soft and fresh from rain, and I found the usual set, the large left and right in the clay, the stride I knew, and beside them, partially overlapping on the right side, a second set, smaller, the same proportions, the same plantigrade profile, the same clarity of impression in the clay, but the heel pad measured about 3 inches wide, not 4.5. The length ran about 14 inches. The stride spacing was about 40 inches. I crouched over the smaller set for a long time. 14 inches, 40-inch stride. A proportional foot and a proportional gait to accompany a body considerably smaller than the one I'd been observing. Not a small adult. Not quite fully grown either, by the proportions. Moving alongside the larger set, not behind it, the 2 sets of prints parallel and same-aged, the clay still moist and uncracked in the deepest impressions. I photographed them all carefully, with scale. Then I sat on the bank for a while with the camera in my lap, and I looked at the hemlock timber to the north, and I let what the 2 sets of tracks implied settle into me gradually, the way a known fact settles after you've stopped arguing with it. A family in the Snowbird drainage, moving through the mountains together on the same route, the same circuit between the high bald country and the Hemlock Creek bottoms. The older one that had learned, over 4 years, to approach the creek bank to within 15 feet and to hold its distance and to communicate in that low, considered tone that had become as much a part of my experience of this place as the creek and the bird calls and the smell of wet hemlock. And the younger one, whose tracks were 40-inch stride and 14-inch foot, learning the same mountain. I did not tell Ricky. I did not tell anyone. Gail retired in early 2017. The wildlife biologist position went unfilled for 18 months, which was typical for a remote district with a limited budget and a competitive applicant pool that moved slowly through the hiring process. During those 18 months, I had full management authority over the East Fence area, with no biological oversight that would have reason to look at that particular stretch of terrain. I used that period with intention. I bought 3 more stealth cams with my own money and placed them at positions of my choosing, on my own time, and over the following 2 years, I added 17 more video clips to the hard drive at my house. All of them from cameras I paid for, placed by me, checked by me, with no chain of custody that touched the district's official documentation. No official record exists of what those cameras captured. The documentation is personal. The chain ends with me. 1990 through 2022. 32 years of total USFS service, 19 of them in the Cheoah District. My knee had been troubled since a slip on the Leatherwood Falls Trail in 2018, a bad step on a root-covered switchback during a spring patrol, and 2 surgeries hadn't gotten it back to where 19 years of mountain walking required it to be. The district was changing as districts change when budget pressure and personnel turnover compound across a decade, and the territory I'd been managing for 19 years was going to be managed differently going forward. I filed my retirement papers in the fall of 2019. My last week on the job, I drove out to the Ledford Road pull-off on a Tuesday morning, late March. Cold rain coming in from the southwest with ice in it above 4,000 feet, which put the Snowbird ridgeline in a glaze and made the hemlock branches slick. I walked the fence line to the hemlock strip in my rain gear, and I sat on the tulip poplar log by the creek and I waited. The tone came after about 20 minutes. From the north, closer than it had been in months, maybe 30 feet. I talked for a while. I told it I was leaving the district. I told it that the cameras I had placed were gone. I'd pulled the last of my personal units 2 weeks prior, and that the new ranger assigned to the district didn't know this stretch of fence existed in any detail and wouldn't have any reason to look at it closely for some time. I told it that Coy Ledford was a good neighbor, and that Ricky was going to be a good neighbor, and that the east pasture would stay managed, as it had been managed since 2014, with the margin built in. The tone responded. 2 sustained notes, a drop between them, a rise at the end. A pattern I'd heard before and couldn't translate into meaning, but that had never felt like nothing. Had always felt like something said by something that had a considered relationship with the act of saying. I stood up from the log. I looked into the hemlock timber, open, not searching. Rain on the branches, ice in the rain, the creek gray and full with snowmelt. I said, I'll be back when I can. I walked back to the pull-off and drove home, and that was my last official day on the Cheoah Ranger District. I've been back 14 times since retiring. Sometimes I park at the pull-off and walk the fence line, and that's enough. Just being in that stretch of ground, feeling the terrain under my boots, smelling the creek and the hemlock and the cold air off the ridge. Sometimes the tone comes from the north, and I sit on the log, and we do what we've been doing for 12 years, the back and forth of talk and response that doesn't require a shared language to carry its meaning. Twice in the past 4 years, the tone hasn't come for several months, and the prints on the creek bank have been old rather than fresh, and I know from long observation that this means the circuit has extended north, deeper into the Snowbird drainage, and that eventually the pattern will resume. It always has. Last July, I was at the log on a Thursday morning. The creek was low for summer, the hemlock branches dry for once, the light in the strip coming through in columns the way it comes through old growth when the canopy is intact and the angle is right. I'd been there about 30 minutes. The tone came from the north, closer than it had been in a while, 20 feet or less, and then a second tone, shorter, higher in register, with a different quality, a brightness to it, from a direction slightly east of the first. 2 separate voices, 2 distinct positions. The familiar low note that I'd been hearing since November of 2012, and beside it, or behind it, or woven into the space around it, the higher note that I'd never heard before from this place. I sat on the log and listened to both of them, and the creek and the birds and the August heat building in the hemlock strip, and I thought about the 2 sets of tracks I'd found in the clay in April of 2016, about what 14 inches of stride and 40-inch stride looks like at full growth 8 years on. About what growing up in the Snowbird Mountains, in the hemlock drainages and the high bald country and the Joyce Kilmer old growth does to a being that already knows these mountains better than any human who has lived here. I didn't move. I held still and I listened to both voices until they stopped, which took a while, and the stopping was gradual rather than abrupt, the tones spacing out and quieting, the way a conversation quiets when both parties have said what they needed to say, and the silence between them is comfortable. Coy Ledford passed in the spring of 2022. He died at 72 in the county hospital in Murphy, which is about 45 minutes down US 129, the death of a man who'd worked hard land for 50 years and whose body eventually gave him an honest accounting of what that costs. I went to the service at the Baptist Church in Robbinsville. Ricky is running the operation now. I see him at the feed store occasionally, or at the one diner in town that's been there longer than either of us. We talk about cattle prices and road conditions and the weather, and neither of us mentions the east pasture or what's in the hemlock strip, and we've been good at not mentioning it for 10 years now. The east fence, the original boundary fence with the bent posts, has come down mostly on its own. The wire is in a tangle on the ground, rust and vegetation working on it year by year, the forest taking back what the fence took from it in 1940-something. I've thought about going out and clearing the tangle. I've decided to leave it. Wire on the ground is less of a hazard to deer than wire in the air, and whatever walks that ground walks it without an obstacle now. I keep the hard drive in a fireproof safe in my bedroom. On the drive, the original 47-second clip from October 22nd, 2012. The 17 additional clips from cameras I placed and paid for myself. The photographs of the tracks, dated and measured. The audio recordings I started making in 2015 on a small digital recorder I carried in my jacket pocket, more than 40 minutes of the tonal communication from the hemlock strip, documented across 3 seasons. Field notes in a Word document that runs to over 100 pages, dates and behavioral observations and weather conditions, and the kind of detail that anyone who has done wildlife fieldwork would recognize as serious documentation. And a separate file, a plain text document that contains the names of 2 people I trust, with instructions about what the drive contains and where I'd want it to go if I'm not around to decide. That plain text document has been updated twice since I wrote it. I add to it when I think of something I should have said. The latest addition is a set of coordinates for the hemlock strip, and a note about what time of day the tone is most likely to come, and what posture to hold when you want to communicate that you're not a threat. Practical information. The kind of thing that took me years to figure out, and that I don't want to stay buried in my silence when there are people who might use it well. I come back to the original 47 seconds more than anything else on that drive. Not because it's the most detailed documentation, which it's not. Not because it's the clearest footage, which it also isn't. I come back to it because of what it shows in those 47 seconds, specifically in the last 3, and because of what those 3 seconds imply about the mind behind the amber eyes. It came to a fence in the dark. It freed a deer that was trapped. It knew the camera was there, and it looked at the camera anyway. And in the look, there was no fear, and no aggression, and no performance for an audience. Just the acknowledgement of being seen by something that understood what being seen meant. I have spent 32 years as a federal ranger in one of the most biologically significant forest systems east of the Mississippi River. I have cataloged more species of plant and animal and fungus in that time than I can easily count. And I have operated in the conviction that my job was to protect what existed in those forests from the consequences of existing in a world that didn't always make space for wild things. What lives in the snowbird drainage is the most intelligent, most considered, most aware being I have encountered in 32 years of working the wildest country in southern Appalachia. It has never asked anything of me except to be left alone. It has given me, without asking permission and without negotiation, 12 years of evidence that there is more in these mountains than the official catalog contains, and that some of the things in these mountains have been here long enough to know the difference between a camera that is a threat and a man on a log who is not. I have tried to honor the first request. I have tried to be worthy of the second. The hemlock strip is there. The creek runs through it. The tone comes in the cold morning air, and 2 voices answer each other in the summer heat, and the amber eyes are in the deep shadow of the brow ridge, and the tracks go north into the Snowbird Mountains, and nobody official is looking, and the mountains keep their own record, the way they always have, as they always will, long after any of us have stopped having opinions about what belongs in them. That's what I know. That's what I've kept. It's been worth keeping.